Welcome to Novara Live. We're on day 18 of the war on Iran, and it's been a very significant one. Mainly, that's because Israel has announced they have assassinated one of Iran's most senior leaders, Ali Larijani. Also, though, it's because in Washington, the US counterterrorism chief has resigned in protest at the war, which he said was started because the Israel lobby tricked Donald Trump. A real Trump loyalist, a very dramatic resignation. On a day of important developments, I'll be joined throughout the show by a brilliant guest. Daniel Levy is a British-Israeli political analyst, a former Israeli negotiator during the Oslo process, and he also recently launched a brilliant Substack, which you should all check out. Daniel, welcome back to the show.
Despite the circumstances, as they're always quite bleak, it's good to be with you, Michael.
Yeah, we need to find a good news story to get you on for, but it will probably keep being
until
the Middle
then.
East. Until then,
yes. Maybe Arsenal. Yeah, carry on.
So we will be discussing those two big events from the day, also doing a broader deep dive into Israel's strategy in the Iran war. And we've sort of been touching on that over the past 2 weeks, but I thought it would be useful to go deep with someone really in the know, and Daniel is very much someone who fits that bill. As ever, if you enjoy the show, please do consider becoming a supporter at novaramedia.com/support. Straight into that first story. Israel today announced they have killed Ali Larijani, who was Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council and who was, after the assassination of the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, perhaps the most important political leader in Iran. Israel also claims to have killed the commander of Iran's Basij militia unit, which is the internal wing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or IRGC. Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed the assassination in a video message today.
This morning, we managed to kill Ali Larijani, the leader of the IRG, a group of thugs who are wreaking terror in Tehran and all across Iran. We also killed the leader of the Basij. They are the assistant thugs who are wreaking terror in all the Iranian cities. We are working with our jet fighters, warplanes, drones to shake the foundation of the regime, hoping to give an opportunity to the Iranian people to oust the regime. It will not be an easy task.
So Netanyahu there described Larijani as a thug. It's true, Larijani was partly responsible for bloody crackdowns in Iran earlier this year. Netanyahu, though, presumably has even more blood on his hands. Larijani played a central role in Iranian politics for decades. He was a scholar. He's got a PhD in philosophy. He wrote multiple books on Immanuel Kant. And among other positions, he served as a senior officer in the Revolutionary Guards, the culture minister, the head of propaganda, speaker of the parliament, presidential candidate, and as of last year, secretary of the Security Council. In a profile published 3 days before he was killed, so 3 days ago, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz wrote in a profile that, quote, Larijani is widely regarded as the most powerful man in Iran, the one who holds ultimate authority over national security and foreign policy. He was not chosen as successor to the supreme leader, not only because he is not his son, so Ali Khamenei's son, but also because he is not a cleric, a necessary condition for the role. Yet he is the man expected to guide the newly appointed leader at every turn as he enters the job during a particularly complex period. Of course, if Mojtaba Khamenei was going to rely on this gentleman, Larijani, to advise him in this difficult period, that's no longer a possibility. Daniel Levy, would you agree with that characterization from Haaretz there? And if so, I mean, how significant is this assassination?
Well, clearly Larijani played a very significant role. And the question then becomes both what was the intent behind this extrajudicial killing, this assassination, and how will it impact the core competence of the governing structure in Tehran as it moves forward? Look, the list of folks Israel has killed is full of people who were apparently irreplaceable and whose removal would be the moment. Once we're done with this person, the head of the snake, it's it's a whole new future that lies before us. I think in the case of Larijani, with the removal of others in particular, he was in a nodal position. But again, I think the idea that this somehow is a decapitation, that this leads to serious erosion, as there was no plan for what happens if he was removed. So yeah, I think he, from what especially those who are in the weeds of the Iranian system have told me previously, and I've checked in with people today, they said, look, he played a very important nodal role linking the clerical establishment to the security establishment to the political establishment. He had an experience in dealing with the outside world. He was an important interlocutor on the regional stage as well. Irreplaceable? Really not so much. Difficulty in others carrying that role, especially in a time of war? Yes. But I would also point out the following. There is such a thing, I think we have to take seriously, as this idea of strategic martyrdom, that people, ordinary people, and there's been a lot of talk also by folks who follow this very closely, the way Israel and the US have gone about this egregious illegal military action in Iran is fueling, as one could predict, right, is fueling a nationalist sentiment. And this, despite the role that Larijani played, may well contribute to that. And so in a strategic martyrdom, I think it also allows people to draw a contrast between a figure serving a governing structure who said in advance, I may well become a martyr in this role. And you can compare and contrast that to the grifters who are running, for instance, the administration in Washington, D.C., the people who are in this in a very significant self-enrichment role. They never put themselves on the line. Trump never served in the military. I don't think any of the senior officials surrounding him, the Witkoffs, the Kushners, that kind of thing. So I think it in some ways strengthens a certain narrative.
And there have been lots of people sort of today, saying, just whatever you think about Larijani, he was clearly an intelligent man, he was competent, he had experience, and he was someone who, would have the political capital to negotiate some kind of ceasefire, if there were to be one. I think he was involved in the nuclear negotiations beforehand. Do you think that the fact that it's Israel who killed him, so obviously there's two big players in this war, the US and Israel against Iran, but it seems to be Israel who are sort of systematically taking out any of Iran's political leadership. And do you think they are purposefully taking out people who would possibly be a person who the Americans could negotiate with, because that's not the outcome they want?
So I think we have to take very seriously the idea that there is something to that. Look, he was, I don't know if you've seen, there's this clip of Netanyahu with Huckabee, the American ambassador to Israel. They're walking along and they're kind of joking about who they take out next and who they've taken out so far. And it's quite unpleasant, but it's par for the course. And so, was this a moment of opportunity? Did this killing take place? And so often now you look at Israel and say, is this a killing machine with a state? Because it seems to be a one-trick pony. Israel knows military, it knows killing, and unfortunately not much else. But was this a moment of opportunity and therefore this assassination was carried out? Was this in order to, as you have suggested, undermine any possible negotiation? So we've heard Trump a few times, because lucky us, we are treated every day to these rambling, flailing rants that he conducts in front of the press. And a couple of times he said, our biggest problem is we've got no one to talk with. They seem to have killed all the guys that we could have talked to. And that, I think we should assume, is part of an intentional Israeli strategy. But I question whether we're likely to be in a negotiating space anytime soon. So I think this has less to do with who America could negotiate with, because I think America has really sent the signal as to how unserious, in fact, how much of a ruse for war their diplomacy is. I don't think anyone can take these clowns, Witkoff and Jared Kushner, seriously. So I don't think this is about so much undermining that negotiation. It feels to me more like it is of a one with Israel's attempt at regime collapse. And they hope that if you can remove enough of these figures, if you can do enough damage, if you can shake the foundations of the governing structures, then the regime, and I think what their intention is for the state, will collapse, implode, and descend into the realm of chaos. That hasn't been going so well. At the beginning, we were told regime change was the goal. Ending the regime is something that Trump said in a press conference again on March 16th. So that was yesterday. And so I think it may have more to do with that and to do with their hope of the capacity for the governing structures there to maintain core competencies than it has to do with trying to end any negotiation. We do, I think the reports of America reaching out to negotiate are more credible than the reports of Iran doing so. But you also have countries in the region who are trying to act as mediators. This will make that more difficult, that's for sure.
And let's take a step back, because this idea, well, not this idea, this reality of just targeting the leaders of foreign states and assassinating them, is that new? I mean, we've obviously seen Israel do it a bunch of times. Trump killed Qasem Soleimani. The Israelis killed Haniyeh, who was the political leader of Hamas, and they killed Nasrallah. Putin, I think, for a while was trying to kill Zelensky. Was there ever a norm that you didn't try and kill foreign leaders, or was it just that it wasn't possible before, and now that we've got drone technology and sort of targeted missiles, it's only now become possible that you can have as one of your sort of tactics in war to just assassinate your opponent?
And of course, the kidnapping of Maduro in Caracas. But, you know, you go back to coups. Look, go back to some of the post-independence leaders elsewhere. Look at what happened to Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Look at what happened to Sukarno in Indonesia. Look at the coups that have been mounted. So, yes, I think the assassination is enjoying a renaissance, inspired by Israel. But I also think it's worth noting that, you know, whenever you see Israeli or American spokespeople, you just showed that clip of Netanyahu, he's a thug, these guys deserve to die. There is an Israeli prime minister who has an international criminal court arrest warrant against his name. Does that make him a legitimate target for extrajudicial assassination? This is the undermining of any kind of sense that we live in a global space governed by any kinds of laws, conventions, charters, norms. And as implied in your question, Michael, I think these are very dangerous precedents to set. And I think we may all look back and rue what Israel got away with, whether it's in assassinations, whether it's in the use of AI technologies in Gaza, for instance, some of which is now being replicated, we understand, in Iran, and say, wow, this opened the floodgates.
Let's take a step back and talk about sort of the overall strategy of Israel in this war. You've sort of already suggested that they want state collapse in Iran. I suppose I want to contrast this to Donald Trump. So there's now a sort of growing consensus, I think, or there has been really from day one, that Donald Trump doesn't know what he's doing. The argument as to why he's gone to war constantly changes. He wants regime change. He wants a Delcy Rodriguez-style character from within the regime who can basically keep everything the same but be a bit more friendly to the United States. He wants to enable protests to break out in the streets. You know, it's constantly changing. He seems like he wants to get out, and so this war looks to most people like it's a bit of a failure from Donald Trump's perspective. Is Netanyahu still looking at this war as a massive victory? Is it going to Israel's plan so far?
So I think if not the key component of the plan was achieved in minute one or maybe minute -1 when Netanyahu managed to drag an American president into his big Iran war after decades of trying. There was a brief moment of success on that front in June of 2025, right? There's the Israeli 11-day war that was launched against Iran. There's an exchange of fire. On day 12, in comes Trump with his Operation Midnight Hammer. Ever since then, you saw how he talked about that. So there was part of the MAGA world that was saying, okay, it was escalate to de-escalate. It was one and done. Then he laid down the line to Israel, this has to stop. But in the months after that, you saw the increased intensity with which Netanyahu, the Israel lobby, the neocons inside the administration pushed for a more expansive operation. Netanyahu visited the US to see Trump twice in the 8 weeks preceding the launching of this war. Netanyahu apparently finally found an American president, let's not mince our words, stupid enough to do this. For decades, you've had administrations of a Republican and a Democrat persuasion who they were willing to do an awful lot for Israel. They were willing to run cover on whatever criminality Israel wanted to enact against the Palestinians. That reached a new low with the genocide in Gaza. But you didn't have a president, even Trump in his first term, who Netanyahu could maneuver into this. So, first of all, the big success was to get America to launch this, because the assumption was that if America goes for a major operation against Iran, at a minimum, this would lead to a significant degrading of Iranian military capacity. And if one managed to go beyond that, then it could lead to the scenario that I suggested is the desirable scenario on the Israeli side, which is, can you turn Iran into another regional space of chaos, of fragmentation, of the dismantling of a central state? That obviously changes the power equation in the region, but I think crucial for Israel, that would spill over to surrounding states, and it would take Israel to a new level in terms of its ability to say, you want security in this region, it passes through us. We're the only military power strong enough to run this show. And crucially, because none of this makes sense unless you factor in that central to the project, central to what Israel wants to do, is what they call total victory against the Palestinians, is ending that question. And they know that, you may have elites who say, you know what, we're sick of the Palestinian question. But there is also an awareness that Israel's gratuitous cruelty towards the Palestinians, the way Israel goes about talking of its holy war, of its Islamophobia, of its anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism, does not play well. And therefore, you have to do this through being a hard power hegemon. So that's the goal. If you can achieve that with America, great. If you can go somewhere towards that with America, that's also okay. And having said everything I've just said, Michael, I don't want to entirely neglect the notion of American agency, okay? So yes, I don't think this happens without an Israeli push for it. I think Netanyahu's push was absolutely crucial. But you have had a failed American policy which made this possible. You have had an American narrative around Iran. You have had a willingness to repeat the Israeli BS, to add its own BS when it came to the characterization of the governing structures in Iran, what they were trying to achieve, whether negotiations could achieve that, whether you could create a regional security architecture that included Iran. And all of that is an American failing, not just a piece of Israeli sophistry to pull them into the war. But it wouldn't have happened without Netanyahu pulling him in.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're going to talk about this a bit more towards the end of the show when we talk about the resignation of Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, in terms of sort of to what extent this was driven by the Americans or the Israelis. I suppose focusing on the Israeli perspective, though, because I hear the argument, and I buy the argument, that sort of Israel wants to be the only sort of the undisputed military hegemon in the Middle East, because that's the only way it believes it can achieve its ambition of a greater Israel and eradicating the Palestinians, essentially. But I also, sort of how that concretely works is a bit unclear to me. So sort of take the example of Gaza. Clearly what Israel wanted to do after October the 7th in order to sort of achieve their goals of a greater Israel was kick 2 million Palestinians in Gaza into Egypt. Like that was their first preference. And they felt unable to do that. I mean, so what they did is they decided, what we'll do is we'll just leave the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and then kill them, right? But, it wasn't a humanitarian outcome. But they didn't get their first choice. And that wasn't really because of Iran. If Iran was a collapsed state at that point in time, the Egyptians would still feel like having 2 million Palestinians ethnically cleansed from Gaza into their country would be destabilizing. And I suppose I'm struggling to see how, even if Israel becomes the undisputed military hegemon in the Middle East, it gets to have the greater Israel, because the whole point is the Palestinians will continue to exist.
Yeah, so first, let me be very clear. I don't think they're going to achieve this. I think this is recklessly irresponsible overreach. Someone who disagrees with me on that, but agrees that is the project, might turn around and say, well, prove us wrong. So far, we're managing to do this. So far, we're about to apparently establish a greater buffer zone in Lebanon. Israel's got a buffer zone in Syria, well beyond the illegally annexed Golan Heights. Of course, the control of the West Bank and Gaza. And this has all been achieved with impunity, with the support of the US and in most key respects of Israel's other Western allies. So nonetheless, I don't think it can work. What is the theory of the case, if you like? I think what Israel is, and one of the pieces of this may well be, we have America. And right now, if you're sitting in the Gulf, you're on the horns of a really hard dilemma, because America is your security guarantor, but having American bases in your country makes you more exposed and vulnerable, is a danger to you. And you thought that purchased you some hearing, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars of investments as well, maybe. That gave you some kind of traction that you'll be listened to in Washington. Along comes this, and the Israelis say, no, the only people Washington listens to is us. They don't actually give a damn. So they're on the horns of a dilemma. But I think what Israel is trying to show is, A, for as long as America is the undisputed power, they do our bidding. We've got them. So you can't create a crack between us and the US. But secondly, if America is going to eventually withdraw more from this region, we can talk about the bigger picture consequences of this conflict and where it may lead. But if that is the case, then who are you going to call? Us. And I think what Israel is trying to show is that what they achieved with the UAE, which isn't just, some nice accord. It is a deep security and economic relationship. And the message is, drop your circumspection when it comes to the Palestinians. We are the nuclear power in the region. Get on board with this. Come under our umbrella. We can bring India into this. They're our friend. Perhaps we can bring NATO into this, or what used to be NATO into this. They see the advantages. We've got Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa. We can create a regional security architecture, but we are at its core. And Bibi's gamble is these guys won't be able to get their act together, won't be able to come up with an alternative, won't be able to club together and say, you know what, no, that doesn't work for us. This really exposes us domestically. We don't trust you. This is your project for, as you say, a greater Israel. And his bet is that's not going to work out. And in fact, you already hear in Israeli political and security circles talk of, well, you know what, there might be another holdout. That's Turkey. Turkey. So you now hear the Israeli leadership saying, well, after Iran, we've got to take down Turkey because that is also a potential fly in the ointment of this plan. Now, I don't think it works out. I don't think either in the short term in terms of the outcomes of this war that they have unleashed, but also as a longer term proposition. And even if I'm overstating the case, I think it is hard to argue with the idea that Israel is trying to achieve at least a maximal degree of military domination and hard power hegemony, even if it does not extend to the extent that I just suggested.
So Israel wants to be the only power in the Middle East so that all of these countries are dependent on them. And then, so to go back to the Gaza example, if the Egyptians were to sort of say, you know, we won't approve the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza, then Israel will say, well, you know, your security is reliant on us. And so maybe they would then be a bit more pliable than they were the last time around. Is that what sort of they're thinking?
Yeah. And look, let's also, I don't need to tell you this. Of course, there is not a ceasefire in Gaza. You know, it's 600 closing in on 700 Palestinians killed since the supposed ceasefire in Gaza. Israel directly occupies 58% of Gaza. So the Palestinians are already squeezed into this small area. And it may be that Israel says, well, you know what? If we keep them in this tiny area, we can encourage out-migration. They don't have to end up permanently in Egypt. Some of them can stay in this small pocket. And by the way, it's not like things are going swimmingly in the West Bank, as you know. So this is the largest and most extensive ongoing Israeli military operation in the West Bank. Masses of destruction, focus on refugee camps. And Jordan is looking at this very anxiously. But none of those countries have managed to wean themselves off of the dependent relationship on America, and therefore by extension on Israel, still maintain these close military relationships with Israel. And Israel is betting that any attempt to put together a coalition that could militarily contain or deter Israel will not see the light of day. I think some of these countries are saying, you know what, we're not in love with this Iranian system and with how it operates, but we don't actually want the balance of power to be tipped so much further the other way. Before this all kicked off, you were actually seeing, and I don't want to overstate it, okay, it was nascent, but you were seeing a greater degree of at least flirtation in terms of what might a new kind of arrangement look like that would involve Saudi, Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, maybe Somalia, after Israel recognized Somaliland. And you had this significant tension between Saudi and UAE, because the Saudis were saying, actually, your project with the Israelis is now directly undermining our national security. You were across the water from us in Sudan. That isn't playing well for our interests. But now you've gone further in Yemen. So there are these tensions. And to me, at least, it is not a given how this plays out, partly because, as in Europe and as in Asia, in the Gulf region and the Middle East, they are witnessing firsthand, and in this respect, very painfully, the unreliability and unseriousness of America as your prime ally and security guarantor.
This is all sort of long-term strategic questions of alliances. I want to sort of go into a more local issue, I suppose, a more immediate issue, which is the ambiguity about how successfully Israel is performing militarily in this war, and specifically how effective they are being at deterring missiles from Iran, and how the Iron Dome is performing, because there are arguments being made that actually a surprising number of missiles or drones are getting through, and that Israel is running low on interceptors. As far as I know, there's quite a lot of censorship here, so we don't have a particularly clear idea. I wonder if you can speak to this. What do we know about how well Israel is performing militarily in this war?
Yeah, there is a high degree of censorship. There are things that slowly came out after June in terms of the extent of the damage after the 12 days in June 2025. What I think we can say, Michael, is there has been, and I think many people have drawn attention to this, there has been something of a race going on, right, since this was launched. Could America and Israel sufficiently degrade Iranian missile launching capacity before Iran could deplete missile interception capacity on the Israeli-American side? It seems quite clear, I don't think this is disputed, that Iran was using relatively low-cost, it's cheaper missile drones, and they were burning through on the Israeli-American side significant stocks of interceptors. They then had to make the calculation, it seems, of allowing some stuff through, that they wouldn't use quite as much of that stock for all of these things, that Iran was holding in reserve some of its more effective missile weaponry. And I think that's where we still are. We have seen, it seems, that inside Israel, some of the things used in the second week were an upgrade on some of the things used in the first week. I don't think this is causing absolute mayhem inside Israel. Israelis are not sleeping, they're running to the shelters, but they have shelters, okay? Not so much in the Palestinian areas inside Israel, let alone, of course, in the occupied Palestinian territories. But I take very seriously the idea that if Iran has held in reserve and is still able to launch some of its significant ballistic missile capacity, then Israel has a potential problem in terms of the availability of interceptors. But that's only one part of Iran's strategy, because if not the main component of Iran's strategy has been to not vertically escalate via the US and Israel, which it can't do. I mean, by the way, you have all kinds of nonsense. Like Trump loves talking about how he destroyed the Iranian Navy. Right now, even in the Israeli media, they're saying, who the F talks about the Iranian Navy? The Iranian Navy was never part of the calculation. What Navy is he talking about? There are perhaps swarm boats that can cause problems in the Hormuz Strait, but they've got other ways of causing problems in the Hormuz Strait. Sorry, I digressed. The main part of the Iranian strategy for conducting this asymmetrical campaign was they know they can't vertically escalate against Israel and America. Therefore, they horizontally expanded the theater of this conflict. That's what's going on with the Gulf. As unpleasant as it is for the Gulf countries, they host American bases, create a cost for hosting American bases, create a deterrence effect that no one would want to go back to this, and that Iran wouldn't be seen as simply winning by not losing, but by actually creating a deterrence. So those are the things that they've done. And you can throw other things into the equation. For instance, what's going on with the Houthis, which is an important question in Yemen. Now, if you want to give the most optimistic scenario from an Israeli-US perspective, the Houthis have been degraded and deterred, so they can't join this. A more realistic read, I would suggest, is that Iran has been preparing for the possibility that they manage to achieve a situation of attrition, and that at a certain point in time, the Houthis will come into the equation, and that they are holding this in reserve because they don't need to use them halfway through week 2. And it may even be an opportunity to close down the alternative passage to the Strait of Hormuz, where some of the Gulf energy is now being transported through, which is the Red Sea, which Houthi missiles would effectively deter. So I think if I were to kind of zoom out, big picture, I think this still is in the balance. I don't think it's going well for the US side in particular. I think when you have two parties who have a strategy, Iran and Israel, and one party that is led by incoherence and incompetence, that's the American side, then that side is at an immediate disadvantage. So it is kind of attached at the hip to an Israeli strategy. Israel is the weaker party in that relationship, but if Israel has the strategy and America doesn't, then that kind of turns the table. And so I think the political, economic costs are becoming significant for Trump. And this, as any asymmetrical campaign of this nature will inevitably be, this is a question of endurance. And in that respect, I don't know that many people are betting on American endurance right now.
And I suppose that comes down to not so much about sort of military capacity, but public opinion in a way, because endurance is the tolerance of your political system to endure costs. And obviously the Americans, you know, the cost they're facing at the moment is slightly more expensive petrol, right? Like it's not huge, but because most people in America don't see this as a war that was necessary in any way, even slightly more expensive petrol is too much to bear, and that's enough to make them not support the war anymore. In Iran, obviously, their capacity to tolerate this war is going to be very high, because this is very clearly a war that's existential for Iran. They're the ones who have been invaded. Israel, it seems to me, obviously I'm not in Israel, but from what I'm reading, from what I'm hearing, the Israeli public in general does see this as existential and is therefore willing to incur significant costs. So even though, you know, Israelis are incurring a bigger cost than Americans at the moment, Americans aren't having to go into their bomb shelters. The Israelis are supporting it because they do genuinely see taking out the Islamic Republic as essential to the survival of Israel? I mean, is that the case? Because obviously the explanation that you're giving of what Israel wants, and it's the explanation I buy, is that this isn't really about the survival of Israel. It's about an ambition to have a greater Israel. It's about expansion, not defense. But for the Israeli public in general, do they see this as existential because they genuinely believe that sort of the crazy regime in Iran might just nuke Israel at any moment if they are able to develop a weapon?
I think so. I mean, I do think that when that's what you're told, not just by one leader, because this isn't about Netanyahu, this is about a system. This has wall-to-wall Zionist support, okay? All the Zionist parties in the Knesset, that's 110 out of 120 members of the Israeli parliament, are backing this war. Some are trying to overtake Netanyahu from a more extreme position. Why didn't you launch it earlier? Things like this. There's criticism over, did you prepare us well enough? Did you prepare the shelters? Should you have been moving ahead with your judicial overhaul and causing polarization when we need to come together for war? But Israelis have been so marinated in this idea that although they are a nuclear-armed state and Iran isn't, and Iran signed up to and adhered to a deal which would have made that ever more likely, and the guy you just killed, who was 86 years old, issued the fatwa that Iran would not become a nuclear-armed state. Despite all of that, what they are told is that the rhetoric coming out of Tehran is what they had to pay attention to. The interpretation of that offered by their side, their leadership, their military establishment is what you have to pay attention to. Of course, when their own leadership constantly threatens genocide on the Palestinians, oh no, they're just getting a bit carried away. So I do think that there is significant public patience, public willingness to go along with this. Is there a snapping point? You know, it's tiring. It's economically damaging. It's obviously very disruptive. But at the moment, look, at the moment he has the support. I wanted to say that there are nagging doubts surfacing, okay? There's the beginnings of did we set the bar of expectation too high? Have we maybe achieved the most we can achieve? The country's not going to collapse. There's not going to be regime change. Are we going to run out of interceptors, for instance? So there's the beginnings of that questioning. But on a day like today, the sugar high of it's a friend of mine who I spoke to in Israel today said, "Here we are back being goldfish again." I said, "What do you mean goldfish?" He said, "It's as if we have no memory. It's as if every time there's an assassination and we go, yay, we all have a party, that is going to change the fundamental equation." It doesn't change the fundamental equation. But as you hinted at, that question of endurance doesn't really depend so much on Tel Aviv. I mean, it may, if the destruction got greater, if things were getting through, but the primary question of endurance plays out in the US, because without the US, Israel can't continue the war. By the way, it may be able to continue the war in Lebanon, and we haven't spoken about that, and I doubt we'll go into it in detail. But, almost 1 million people displaced, and I fear that unless it is part of an agreement for a de-escalation rather, if this war is simply both sides declare victory and stop firing, that Israel will carry on in Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, really concerning there, the humanitarian situation, because I suppose everyone's focused on the war in Iran because, I mean, there's something novel about that, and also because the Strait of Hormuz is affecting the entire global economy. What's happening in Lebanon isn't having much effect beyond Lebanon, as far as I can tell. But it is a humanitarian catastrophe with millions of people displaced.
It's okay because the UK and some other governments have issued a statement saying it should stop. So we're fine on that.
Yeah,
sorry, that was me being naughty.
Yeah, well, the West is very concerned, and
yes.
As we know, if you ask Israel nicely to stop killing people, it always pays strict attention.
Yes.
Let's move on to events in Washington, dramatic events in Washington today. A top US official has resigned in protest at Donald Trump's war on Iran, citing the undue influence of the Israel lobby. Joe Kent was director of the National Counterterrorism Center, significant position. He is a US Special Forces and CIA veteran whose wife, who was a member of the Navy, was killed in a suicide bombing in Syria in 2019. He was appointed by Donald Trump to that role. This is what he said in his resignation letter, which he posted to X. President Trump, after much reflection, I have decided to resign from my position as director of the National Counterterrorism Center effective today. I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. I support the values and the foreign policies that you campaigned on in 2016, 2020, 2024, which you enacted in your first term. Until June 2025, you understood that the wars in the Middle East were a trap that robbed America of the precious lives of our patriots and depleted the wealth and prosperity of our nation. In your first administration, you understood better than any modern president how to decisively apply military power without getting us drawn into never-ending wars. You demonstrated this by killing Qasem Soleimani and by defeating ISIS. Early in this administration, high-ranking Israeli officials and influential members of the American media deployed a misinformation campaign that wholly undermined your America First platform and sowed pro-war sentiments to encourage a war with Iran. This echo chamber was used to deceive you into believing that Iran posed an imminent threat to the United States and that you should strike now. There was a clear path to swift victory. This was a lie and is the same tactic the Israelis used to draw us into the disastrous Iraq war that cost our nation the lives of thousands of our best men and women. We cannot make this mistake again. As a veteran who deployed to combat 11 times and as a Gold Star husband who lost my beloved wife Shannon in a war manufactured by Israel, I cannot support sending the next generation off to fight and die in a war that serves no benefit to the American people, nor justifies the cost of American lives. I pray that you will reflect upon what we are doing in Iran and who we are doing it for. The time for bold action is now. You can reverse course and chart a new path for our nation, or you can allow us to slip further towards decline and chaos. You hold the cards. And then he says it was an honor to serve in your administration and to serve our great nation. Now, Joe Kent had been one of many controversial figures in the Trump administration. He was under pressure in his confirmation hearings due to links to extremist far-right groups, including members of the Proud Boys. In that confirmation hearing, he also refused to back away from claims he'd made that federal agents had fomented the January the 6th riots at the US Capitol, or his claims that Trump had in fact won the 2020 election. So he is, very much a MAGA person. And, when you're speaking of MAGA people, you can often assume that their criticisms of the Israel lobby might veer into sort of, this is presumably not someone who is a principled anti-racist. Let's put it like that. Trump was asked about Kent's resignation today.
Mr. President, your director of national counterterrorism, Joe Kent, he just resigned today. He said he can't support your conflict with Iran. What's your reaction to that? And did you?
Well, I read his statement. I always thought he was a nice guy, but I always thought he was weak on security, very weak on security. I didn't know him well, but I thought he seemed like a pretty nice guy. But when I read his statement, I realized that it's a good thing that he's out, because he said that Iran was not a threat. Iran was a threat. Every country realized what a threat Iran was. The question is whether or not they wanted to do something about it.
Very serious story about just Donald Trump saying, I always thought he was weak on security. And then you put him in literally
so I made him
in charge of counterterrorism. Right? He's the most important person in terms of counterterrorism in America, and you always thought he was weak on security. As you can see, I'm still joined by Daniel Levy. How significant do you think this resignation is?
Well, I think what's significant here is the reasons that Kent gave for his resignation are not landing in a vacuum, right? Everything he says there is, other than referencing Epstein, is word for word what a significant cohort of Trump's own MAGA base believes to be taking place. This is the argument over Israel first, America first, and a quite senior administration official. Let's also just acknowledge more senior than anyone who resigned from the Democrat administration in opposition to their enabling of the genocide in Gaza. Different thing. This is America going to war. But this is a senior official resigning already at this stage and giving vent to the most resonant critique that is out there on the right of what is going on, of who pulled America into this war, of who this war is for, which forces were behind it, and all of that sound centers around an Israel first agenda. We've seen some of these quotes from Charlie Kirk re-emerging. We've seen some of these claims from this murdered important Turning Point USA figure, Charlie Kirk, emerging. We've seen the critique that's out there. And this is one of the problems for Trump. And it's a problem that gets worse. The more this will go on, the more some of those potential economic consequences will kick in. And I ask myself the question, both how will this play out in the US? Because this is quite unprecedented to go to war with such a divided country on day one, right? So Afghanistan, 90% plus support. Iraq, 70% plus support. Bipartisan political support in the American establishment, in Congress. Day one, partisanship takes over. It's Democrat versus Republican on this. And inside the Republican base, this huge claim, this huge base on which to not want to be supporting this. So I think that makes it sustainable. But then I ask the question, well, what does that mean for Israel, right? Because my assumption has to be that Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership would have known that this is at least one of the consequences, that it would play out like this. They have seen how Israel's polling numbers have been tanking, have been on a very clear unidirectional trend inside America. And how do you explain that then, that they were willing to risk it? Is it just that this is the most expensive electoral campaign in history? Netanyahu was willing to throw everything at it because he's got an election coming up, he's got his court cases, etc. Maybe, but I don't. For me, that's not a strong enough explanation. And therefore, I would argue one of two things is going on, and maybe a bit of both. Maybe both are okay for Netanyahu and for the Israeli leadership. One is they assume that there'll be a Kent resignation, there'll be a viral Tucker Carlson show, there'll be frustration, the numbers won't look good, but we've got this. If there's one thing Israel knows how to do, it's how to carry American political support. If it's with public opinion, great. If it's against public opinion, that's also fine. We know how to deploy that lobby. We know how to use campaign finance, which other groups use and Israel uses very effectively. And they've been, bless them, really transparent about this. If we can buy up enough legacy media and enough new media, thank you, the Ellison family, they've bought American TikTok, CNN, CBS, the Barry Weisses shilling for them, Warner Brothers Discovery next, then we've got this. So that's one explanation. I would suggest there's another possible explanation, which is that Netanyahu perhaps senses that this might not be a corner he can turn. That both in terms of losing the ability to get America to do your bidding to this extent, and America's ability to do that because we see an America in decline, it's a kind of use it or lose it. And Netanyahu said, you know what, if I can get this president at this moment to throw this American power, not in Asia, not in Europe, not Ukraine, I'm going to bloody use this, and the consequences and the chips will fall as they fall. And I do think that there are going to be consequences. I just want to share this with you because I do think this could have a quite dramatic accelerating impact on American decline. Trump's latest wisdom that he shared with us on his Truth Social is when he said, we don't need any of these countries. He said, we don't need the help of anyone. Trump is primarily turning on America's primary security partners in Europe, in Asia, South Korea, Japan, NATO allies. He's also, as I've said, just exposed to the Gulf that he really does not take seriously their prime national security interests. America is burning its alliances left, right, and center. But one country apparently still has this hold. And I think that's a dangerous signal for Israel to be sending for its own future as well. And, I think it poses a real challenge how to call that out and how to do the right thing on this. But I would say Israel is doing the wrong thing by itself. And if it wants to start as the head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League in America, if it wants to start playing that anti-Semitism card again, then it is being even more reckless. I understand. It's a state. If this is one of the tools in its arsenal, I would expect it to deploy that tool. But to argue that as Greenblatt did, it's anti-Semitism because Israel is being blamed for a Middle East war. What? This is recklessness taken to a new level.
I'm really interested in that use it or lose it argument you've made, because I mean, the thing that Israel has relied upon up until now is the bipartisan support that it has had in Washington. If anything is going to break that bipartisan support down, it is very explicitly tricking Donald Trump into a war which is then an obvious catastrophe, because this isn't like, previous wars that America have gone to. So sort of Afghanistan, I think, had 90% support, Iraq, 70% support. This, I think, is sort of in the 30s or something like that. So this is really going to, unless the Israel lobby is and its money is so just unbelievably powerful, it's unbreakable, that this is going to polarize a large part of the Democratic Party against Israel. It's 50-50 which party wins the next presidential election. If anything, this war is making it less likely that it will be a Republican. So has Israel made a judgment that it can survive, if it gets America to take out the Islamic Republic now, has it made a judgment that it can go alone? It's ready to be the policemen of the Middle East without America's help? Have they made that judgment? And if so, are they correct? Can Israel now survive? Or, give it 2 years. Will Israel then be able to survive without the support of the Americans?
So I think it may well be, considering that the US is on a trajectory where it is not going to be able to assert itself as with primacy, with preponderance, with all those things. Better that America expends its residual, and residual here it's doing a lot of work, that word, okay? Because America still has an awful lot of power. But better it expend that doing stuff for us to take down our enemies than doing something else. Because afterwards, and this is why I think that Israel is looking one step ahead and saying, if we can place ourselves at the center of a new regional management that depends on us as the core player, take the Abraham Accords, take the relationship with the UAE, and build on that manyfold, then it may feel it has its best post-America or more limited American role, management strategy for the future. It's quite remarkable that America put out a national security strategy at the end of last year, where the Middle East was absolutely marginalized as a priority. And yet here we have it. THAAD systems being dismantled in South Korea, placed in the Middle East. The president basically saying, screw you to all his NATO allies. But that seems to have been a conscious approach on the Israeli side. And they're laying down a big bet, because let's just remember that there is an alternative. I mean, let's acknowledge the Palestinians have recognized Israel decades ago. The Palestinian leadership, as discredited as it is still recognized as the national leadership. Keep saying 2 states, a state on just 22% of the territory. That's all we want. In fact, it's going to be less than a state. They seem to be accepting, mistakenly, in my opinion. The Arab states continue to say the Arab Peace Initiative holds. We're in fact willing to go further in terms of integration of Israel. And we can manage Iran. Iran signed a deal in the past. So Israel has this quite remarkable opportunity. Lebanon has been willing to have direct negotiations. Syria under Ashara said, you know what, we're not going to push on the Golan, which you illegally annexed. We're willing to have a non-aggression pact without addressing that question. So you have a world of potential diplomatic opportunities for Israel, and Israel has said no to every single one of them. Israel has decided, has not been forced, it has made a decision that is apparently embedded in the nature of this Zionist project, that the outcome has to be at the expense of the Palestinians, not a mini-state, not anything that acknowledges Palestinian rights, any kind of collective Palestinian presence and future. I think that's a losing gamble. I think Israel is unfortunately sending the signal that we cannot be absorbed into this region. And for me, for what it's worth, the question becomes, therefore, the future and well-being of the Israeli Jewish community, not of the regime and the state project of Zionism. But I'm straying.
I mean, I've got to let you go because it's 7. Very quickly, just someone in the comments did say, this guy is so critical of Israel. How did he ever negotiate for the Israelis? How did that work? So I don't know if you want to sort of summarize that in 2 minutes before I let you go.
I mean, I've gone on a journey, and Israel has gone on a journey. And if you put those two things together, then the distance from me then and Israel now is enough to span what people have just heard if they've been listening to us.
Daniel Levy, thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Always great every time we get you back on the show. And I actually do feel like I have a much stronger sense of what Israel's sort of grand strategy is and the real ambitiousness of it. I mean, the vicious ambitiousness of it, which is to say we can be the global policeman. Well, not the global. We can be the regional policeman of the Middle East on our own. Let's help the Americans get us there, the undisputed kings of the Middle East, before the Americans decline. Like that's coherent.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Scary.
I take it seriously. Yeah. Cheers,
Daniel,
Michael. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much. And thank you guys for watching. We'll be back for another episode of Novara Live tomorrow. That'll be me and Aaron Bastani. For now, my thanks again to Daniel Levy. My thanks again to you for watching. Catch us tomorrow. Good night.